2019. And yet he's prepared to raise this over and over again. In fact, today, what he attempted to do, and the Speaker was correct to not approve it, because what he was asking the Speaker to do was to be complicit in violating the Constitution. He was asking the Speaker, by a motion such as this, to be able to say that the Speaker would allow a motion like this, which flies in the face of the Constitution. The Constitution was interpreted by a court of law that stated that residency did not require one to be in Guyana. It required one to be registered as a voter in Guyana. And fundamentally deducted from that is that if you wish to pay for your fare and come home, then you're free to vote in Guyana's elections. What the APNU has a problem with is mathematics, as always. Mr. Norton today talked about the population of Guyana and the voters list. The problem with that is that he's using a figure of 2012. It is 10 years later. We're now doing a census now. And the population of Guyana has grown. There is no doubt about that. If you ask anybody on the street, the number of cars on the street, unless people in Guyana have 5 cars each, the population has grown in this country. And we expect that probably out of the census, the population may be 800,000 or even more, excluding what are the migrants coming in from Venezuela, for example. So that this use of data that is 10 years old to support his argument flies in the face of what are the experiences of other Caribbean countries. And he's well aware of the IDA report that pointed out for the Caribbean countries, Jamaica, Barbados, St. Vincent, and so on, including Guyana, that all of these countries had voters lists which were high in terms of large numbers in terms of the voting population, between 89 and 90% of the population, of the voting population, on what was on the total population. So Guyana is not unusual in that case, and in fact, there's a whole argument in a number of scientific and research on election reports that point out that it is not unusual to have a large registered population of persons of voting age versus the total population. It is not an unusual occurrence. The main point is the number of people who actually voted. And so Mr. Norton always wants to sidestep the issue that those who voted in 2015 election were using the same database, using the same national registration list, is the same list that put APNU AFC into government. In fact, in 2011, they were the majority and Guyana was minority government with the same database, And so the same thing with 2011, same thing with 2015, and again 2020. And of course, he is well aware, and there's another aspect of the ruling by the Speaker that must be not ignored, and that is that in the Parliament, under admissibility of motions, you're not allowed to bring a motion that anticipates a matter coming before the House. This has been ruled on by different speakers in the past. It is part of the standing orders of Guyana. And that is that today, the electoral bills, the National Registration Bill, Amendment Bill, and the Representation of Peoples Amendment Bill were both tabled for the first time. Those two bills include areas of electoral reform regarding registration, and in fact building into the law what has been a practice, and that is that the Guyana Registrar's Office must, in a periodic and timely way, provide to the GCOM the death certificates of those who have passed so that their names can come off the list. So it was a practice before, and sometimes honored in the breach, sometimes it based on persons who may not have complied with this in terms of administration in GCOM or with GRO. This is now built into the law. The other areas of the bills are important in terms of dealing with how to ensure that the scrutiny of the list The scrutineers, the polling agents continue to be enshrined to make sure that there are no opportunities for voter impersonation, which is the issue that Mr. Norton referenced but did not expand on. The Speaker cannot be complicit with a violation of the Constitution or any attempt to have him as part of whether it is the Speaker Manzoor Nadir, whether it's the Speaker Ralph Ramkaran, whether it is the Speaker Mr. Trotman, or any other Speaker. And so Mr. Nadir was correct. Of course, Mr. Norton likes to paint Mr. Nadir in a particular way as the Speaker. However, there was no such painting of Dr. Scotland as the Speaker in the previous Parliament, where we know that bills were brought for first reading, the standing orders were suspended, and we went through the entire bill, all 3 stages. There was no protest on that. There were motions brought by the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Nagamutu, that no one had seen until it was time to debate it, and it was allowed. So these transgressions did not seem to disturb the conscience of the APNU AFC, nor Mr. Norton as a bystander looking from the outside. However, every time Mr. Manzoor Nadir sneezes, it seems to cause great irritation for Mr. Norton. We have to underline the fact that the COI has commenced. The COI has begun to expose, by the statements being given, expose the collusion of the APNU AFC, coalition government, and GCOM officials and others. And clearly in our mind today is an attempt to distract from the COI and the evidence being presented there, to distract people with another smoke and mirrors. And that's not going to happen, because more and more, despite what Mr. Norton says, the APNU AFC coalition cannot hide from the role they played during the 2020 elections in attempting to thwart the will of the Guyanese people, the electorate, over and over again, repeatedly, for the 5 months. So Mr. Norton can bellow as much as he likes from the far corners, but he is abnegating his responsibility as the leader of the opposition when we have bills here, constitutional reform, which is an important one, which will allow the opposition parties and the government to have equal numbers, and the political parties will have equal numbers with civil society. This is an important model of democracy and constitution reform that has evolved in Guyana and is probably unique to Guyana. So he abnegated his responsibility to speak on that. We have bills on drinking and driving, and using drugs and driving. Important because the issue of alcohol use and driving, or drug use and driving, has no partisanship. It doesn't have a PNC label, an APNU label, an AFC label, or PEPC label. People are not being careful on the roads and are wrecking people's lives. People are dying as a result. Isn't that of interest to the opposition? I would think so, but it appears not. We will come to the suicide prevention bill. This has been an issue debated in the last Parliament by Dr. Vinay Prasad, where we made a number of recommendations for the government on how the then government and how to deal with suicide. And some of you may recall that the motion was defeated, as all the PEPC opposition motions were defeated by the then government. So suicide has also been a social issue of great concern across the country. Again, it crosses partisanship. And therefore, the absence of the opposition is noted as, again, abnegating their responsibilities as members of Parliament and elected officials of their constituency. We have also the Restorative Justice Bill and the Bail Bill. Again, 2 brand new bills that are very modern and very progressive, in which, again, the opposition will be absent and abnegating the responsibility to participate in lawmaking to the betterment and the development of the society. So we have no qualms whatsoever in saying that this mantra that Mr. Norton keeps repeating, clean voters list, is to to take off people who are legitimately on the list. If he wishes this to become a reality, then he has to go through the constitutional reform process. It's a constitutional amendment which requires 2/3 majority. He will then have to win support to that in the constitutional reform process. It cannot be done from the side, shouting from the corners and walking out of Parliament. And he well knows that. It isn't that he doesn't know that. This is all about smoke and mirrors and grandstanding with sitting on quicksand and nothing underneath it. So I just want to make those comments in relation to what happened today in Parliament, in relation to Mr. Norton and the leader of opposition and the withdrawal of the opposition from the House, from this sitting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Gail, my respected elder, Minister of Governance and Parliamentary Affairs. So today, Mr. Norton and his depleted band that was present behaved the way schoolboys behave. Pick up your bat or your ball and run away when you don't get your own way. I will describe Mr. Norton and his depleted bunch that departed the National Assembly today, their actions as intellectual laziness. They had no contribution to make, so they didn't stay. It is political immaturity. Political leaders stand and fight, defend what they believe, and represent the people that elected them. But more so, and I agree with Comrade Gail, this was an attempt to obfuscate the real issues. We have a COI that is in progress, and Mr. Norton is seeking to get headlines to obfuscate and to create a different narrative. In their statement that they issued about the reasons for their walkout and their demands, it holds hollow. For example, he said that the PPP is emasculating the work of the Public Accounts Committee and avoiding scrutiny, and it's a testimony of the corrupt nature of the PPP. Let's put the facts on the table. The Public Accounts Committee is chaired by the APNU AFC. Second fact, the years that are under consideration at the Public Accounts Committee are years that the APNU AFC was responsible for government in this country. The years to be examined are 2018 and 2019. That's where we are. And of course, the parliamentary recess concluded since the 8th of October. The chairman of the Public Accounts Committee had the opportunity to call a sitting of the Public Accounts Committee. He didn't. And now his leader, in his presence, in a bunch, a depleted bunch, is saying the PPPC is emasculating the work of the Public Accounts Committee so as to avoid scrutiny. And this is clear testimony of corruption. We in the PPPC reject that because the facts are clear for all to see. We continue to remain open for transparency, accountability, and good governance. As a matter of fact, in keeping our word as it relates to our manifesto, and also as it relates to the commitment we made to the people of Guyana. One of the presentation of papers today in the National Assembly was the Minister of Finance informing the nation of deposits into the Natural Resources Fund. That is something that we have done to enhance accountability. Because, you know, we had the situation where the APNU received money from the oil company and never reported it, the $18 million signing bonus we're talking about. And they would like to come today to lecture about accountability and transparency. The second issue that I want to address, if you notice, the modus operandi of the opposition leader, like his recent visit to Mocha, instigating, agitating, and basically preying upon the ignorance or the unsuspecting nature of simple people by telling them not to move. How could this be responsible leadership? Everybody in this country who faces traffic congestion on the East Bank wants additional roads so that we could make commute easier, ease of doing business. School children must be able to get home. And you have families who are in the same pathway who have already removed. And I'm informed that Mr. Norton took with him residents from Agricola and went there in such a reckless manner, telling people not to move. Is he anti-development, anti-progress, or is he carrying out a mandate that says mash brakes, they're moving too fast? If we allow the PPPC to get all of these things done, nobody will ever again vote AP and UFC. So let's stand in the way and block all of this. That is why I call it political immaturity. If you want to make representation for people, Mr. Norton could have written the Minister of Housing as a responsible leader for an engagement. But no, you go down on the ground and you create mischief that you cannot resolve. He then puts in his statement issues of cost of living. That's the reason why he walked out of the National Assembly today with his depleted bunch. Rising cost of living. Well, every member of the media and all of Guyanese will know that the PPPC government was never shy in admitting and dealing with the fact that there is an issue with the cost of living. As a matter of fact, in our 2022 budget, $5 billion was allocated to deal with issues of cost of living. But let me remind you that cost of living is not a Guyana issue. We had COVID. As a result of COVID, which was a global pandemic, major issues with supply chain management, logistics, and transportation. Then we have the war, Russia invasion of Ukraine, resulting in a fuel crisis, resulting in a food crisis. Rising food prices is not a Guyana thing, Mr. Norton, APNU, AFC. This is something that is happening around the world. Countries have had to deal with this. Governments have had to deal with this. But let's compare what we did. And I will remind us of how we are dealing with the rising cost of living. But let me just say, I would like to remind Mr. Norton that there was rising cost of living under the Granger government 2015 to 2020. And there was no war between Russia and Ukraine. There was no COVID pandemic. There was no major fuel crisis and food crisis with logistic and supply chain management problems. What was the cause of cost of living 2015 to 2020? Was the hardship measures, taxation, and policy directives that the APNU AFC gave and implemented that impacted the lives of the ordinary man. So let's compare and contrast. Our 2020 budget, our first budget when we came into office, we call it an emergency budget. What's the first thing we did? We removed all of those hardship measures that were implemented by the APNU AFC, whether it was water charges for the water users in the agriculture sector, whether it was the tax on electricity, the VAT on electricity, the VAT on data, the VAT on water, whether it was the VAT on food items that were considered essential food items that drove the price of food up in the supermarkets and in the grocery stores. We removed all of that. So people were able to breathe and have a sigh of relief. Could you imagine if the PPPC had not implemented and removed all of those hardship measures, and the citizens of this country had to deal with the current situation plus what was going on before? That would have been dangerous for our country. But the caring, pro-people, pro-poor, pro-working class administration as we are, kept our word, and we delivered to the people. You can walk around Guyana. When we removed those hardship measures, and that was the first thing we did, the tributous tax on mining, people were able to breathe a sigh of relief and start working again. But we did not stop there. We went on to ensure that there were direct interventions. We started off during the COVID pandemic. I want to remind you, all of those hairdressers and nail technicians and those ladies who sell around schools because schools were closed, and some of the taxi drivers, the small businesses that operate in the villages with their fish and chips and their weekend white pudding and black pudding, all of them that couldn't operate, that they depended on that small business to give them an income, they were suffering. In the midst of COVID, and in the midst of 4 floods during 2020 to 2022, this is what the PPPC did to cushion and improve people's lives during a crisis where there's rising food prices, rising fuel prices. Number one, we started off by reducing the taxes on fuel. And as a result of the removal of taxes on fuel, we would have foregone the receipt of revenues of more than $7 billion. You know what that meant? It meant that $7 billion that would have been paid in taxes to the government, and the consumer would have had to be supplying that money at the pump. Government refused to collect those taxes to ensure that fuel prices remained stable so that people could breathe, live, and survive in the midst of such a difficulty. So more than $7 billion was there. And we did not just reduce it. Remember, we now brought it all the way down to zero. Zero. We started by reducing it percentage-wise, then we brought it all the way down to zero. Now, during the budget presentation of 2022, There are a number of things that government did to continue to ease the impact of rising cost of living. You recall, and we've been talking about this, the cost of freight for a container from China to Guyana or from Singapore to Guyana used to be 4,000, some people pay 2,800 depending on what. Those prices have moved from 4,000, 3,000, 2,800 to 20,000, 17,000, 25,000. You know what's one of the measures we did? In the taxation of containers, we are using the pre-COVID prices and not the prices CIF Georgetown adding in those high freight rates. We are using the pre-COVID prices. So taxation was reduced to ensure that the suppliers and the other dealers did not pass on increases to the consumer. That is what your caring PPPC government would have been doing to assist with the rising cost of living. In terms of job creation, more than 11,000, and I repeat for emphasis, 11,000 part-time workers were hired during this period of rising food prices. You know why? That was a way of putting additional income into families. Along with those 11,000 part-time workers, we have hired an additional 2,500 enhancement workers and an additional 2,500 community service officers. So when you look at what has happened in Amerindian communities, across the regions, and in the various local authority areas, more than 16,000 people have been engaged, bolstering income at the family level. I want to remind, we have paid out a COVID cash grant of $25,000 to every household across the length and breadth of Guyana. The APNU AFC took away $1.6 billion in the Because We Care cash grant from children in 2015. The PPPC, since back in office, has given to the children of Guyana $6 billion. $6 billion. They have taken away 1.6, which they ended up spending on the recurrent side of the budget, on food and drinks and supplies for the boys. We have taken the step of putting $6 billion, the Because We Care cash grant and the uniform assistance. Not only that, every senior citizen in this country did not only receive an increase in old age pension, but they have now, in the context of what is facing the senior citizens, President Ali and his administration has now given a one-off cash grant of the monthly rate of old age pension to every pensioner, $28,000. Ladies and gentlemen, and my fellow Guyanese brothers and sisters, that's not the end of it. We understand there are people in vulnerable communities. For example, persons who are differently able or disabled. We went out with a cash grant to assist the families, because when you have a child or that is differently able or disabled, it takes a lot of effort and money to keep them going as against taking care of a normal child. We recognize that, and we give out a cash grant to all of those families. Our farmers who suffered during the periods of the flood, where we lost crops, livestock, poultry, that affected prices on the market to get people to get back into business, they were able to receive support from the government. Farmers across the length and breadth of Guyana. The fishermen who were having depleted catches, and that was impacting what was taking place in the market in terms of prices. Not only did we put policy interventions to increase yield by going into aquaculture and swam shrimp and growth of tilapia, but we also went to lend support to those fishermen by giving them support and a grant. And you're going to walk out of Parliament and believe the people of Guyana will believe you that it's because the government not dealing with the rising cost of living, that's why you left? You walked out because you are intellectually lazy and you are politically immature. You should have been standing in Parliament to say what else could have been done to improve. But remember, you were there in government, your party and your group was there in government. Without the international conditions that are prevailing today, food prices were going up. You did nothing because the hardships were being imposed by their government. And here you have a government who's responding to a global situation by putting in policy interventions. Quite recently, the miners, their concerns were addressed. Just last week, people in the forestry sector, their issues were addressed. What am I saying? Government is taking the issue of rising food prices and cost of living seriously and making the necessary interventions. And let me remind everybody, because sometimes we forget, when the price of fuel went beyond $100 a barrel up to 126 US dollars a barrel, it was expected that your electricity bill should have gone up and your water bill should have gone up. You know what the government of Guyana did? The president said to GPL and GWI, not 1 cent increase in charges for the population. The government will come in and put in the shortfall. That was an additional subsidy to ensure everybody benefit. Now, who used water? Every Guyanese, no matter how you voted. Who used electricity? Every Guyanese, no matter how you voted or where you live. Those are the kinds of policy interventions that we are making. If you check the record, and I want to challenge ladies and gentlemen of the media to look at the activism of the CDC, meaning the Civil Defense Commission, and in our response to poverty alleviation, sufferings of people, floods, and difficulties, the CDC has never been this active in its history like it's doing right now. Getting hampers out to people in the area when Ittering Bank was flooded out and the mining pits were all flooded and excavators were sinking. We didn't say these are gold miners who have a windfall. We responded by getting out there and lending support. When Kokwani and all of the Burbis River was on the water, the CDC was there. When Blackbush Polder and all the other areas were there, we ensured people's health was protected, their livelihoods were protected, and we ensured they had enough to eat, and we ensured they were safe in terms of health by providing the vaccines for COVID, by providing the necessary interventions in the flood-prone areas. We have not been sitting on our hands. What am I saying? Yes, there is rising food crisis. Yes, things have increased in the market, but your government has made interventions, and had we not made those interventions, what would have been in Guyana was an unbearable situation. But you know what we have? A manageable situation. And what we have is an intellectually lazy opposition who wants to exploit the fact that you might be paying a little bit more for Bora, or the fish price had a $20 extra in it, or meat went up a little bit 1 week because of supply and demand issue. But they have not come to the table with one initiative that could show that as an alternative government, what they would have done differently. So today is just a smoke screen, and the assurance that we would like to give you at the community level, like you would have seen all of our ministers, the president, the vice president, the prime minister, and all members of cabinet have been working in all communities. Coming near you soon is your government working for you addressing your concerns. What we want to assure you is that whatever are the necessary policy interventions that needs to be made, the Irfanali-led administration would not be shy in making those tough decisions and ensuring that our people make it. We will not be distracted, and we will not allow the attempt of obfuscation by Mr. Norton to succeed. We will bring the facts and the truth to the people of Guyana. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Edghill. Thank you very much, Minister Edghill. I don't know if any of the media wish to raise any questions. The floor is open to you. Just to help me along, if you could introduce yourself and the media house you're representing. While you're thinking, just to say that we want to express our solidarity with the young journalists, videographers who were harassed and intimidated and threatened at Mr. Norton's meeting in Mocha yesterday evening. And we're very happy the Guyana Press Association has come out with a strong statement. We have never and we do not support the harassment of the media and journalists in our country. We lived through the period of when there was the harassment of journalists and saw the death of Father Dark, for example, as the epitome of a photographer a photojournalist actually doing their job, including people like Father Morrison and so many more, Father Wong, and many others, too many to name in that era. So we are wedded to that view of press freedom and the protection of the media from intimidation, threats, and physical violence. So we'd like to say to the two young men who were there, do not be afraid. We in the government will not stand by such bullyism to take place again in no matter which political party is having their meetings or any organization. So I just wanted to say that to thank you, and to, if there are no questions, if we've answered everything clearly and there are no gray areas or issues you wish to raise, can I then close the press briefing? Charbon, it's okay, because you know you're the elder of the Press Association. Beg your pardon?
I may be the elder in the room, but not the elder in the press.
I think I'm the elder in the room, but I think you may be the elder in the media. So anyway, we'll debate that outside of the hall. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. Yes, you have a question?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, to what extent is the Bureau of the Government can be found to address the opposition's concerns? For instance, dealing with the question of, or the call for biometrics at polling stations as a middle ground, because you pointed out some other challenges that the calls by the opposition are facing at the moment.
Mr. Cabral, you are well aware that there is biometrics in the law already for registration and at the polling station. So the polling, and that's in the law already before the amendments that we're bringing now. So that I don't quite know what Mr. Norton is talking about. The biometrics we have is the photograph of the person and the fingerprints and the, what you call, biodata of the person, where they live, how old they are, etc., their occupation. Unless, and Mr. Norton has not pointed out, to enhance biometrics, which would mean things like biometrics that include your irises, like they do at immigration in the United States. I'm not hearing him say that. So the biometrics, my understanding of what he's saying, but he's so confusing sometimes, is that we have biometrics already in our law. We practice biometrics already in terms of registration, and that at the polling station on the day of elections, the folios are with the polling agents of the parties that are observing the polling station, and with the presiding officer, and with the, what you call, the first clerk. You come in at the door, so that a person has to give their biodata. If the ID card, the photograph of the person doesn't match their ID card, then they have to ask other questions. And so The issue is provided for in law, and obviously in terms of the new bill that was tabled today, you're looking at where there are violations of that, where, for example, someone tries to, a polling presiding officer allows a person who doesn't look like their photograph or does not have the proper identification, in terms of biometrics, there will be offenses. And so this is enhancing the biometrics. However, there is law, and those are issues we're dealing with. But in the last election, nor in the 2011 election, as far as I can remember, the issue of biometrics was ever a problem in terms of something we need to overcome, we need to correct, we need to do better, etc. And from the GCOM point of view, the database includes the fingerprints, all 10 fingerprints of everyone. In many countries, it's not both hands, it's maybe just one finger that is used. So I'm not sure what he's talking about. If he's talking about electronic voting, that's different from biometrics. Electronic voting and biometrics are not the same thing. You may use your finger to vote, to identify yourself, but that's electronic voting, not biometrics. So I'm not quite sure what Mr. Norton speaks about. He tends to be very glib.
You could never be sure.
And lack of detail and just glibness.
Based on what he has been saying in the press conferences, it appears as though it's some form of enhanced identification before one casts a ballot in terms of the use of the biometrics. My next question.
Well, then, just to cut you, Mr. Cabral, if that were so, then the opposition has every right to put forward amendments to the election bills that have been tabled today. So when we meet next, they can bring up their amendments to look at the actual principal act. They've had a year from November 2021 to do that. They haven't done it. They have the bills now laid in the House for the first time. They can do that again. It is not something that, if we're not clear on what they mean, how can we draft it? The responsibility is on him and his party to be clear what they want. If they want to use the biometrics for voting purposes, then is he saying that every station has to have a device that will confirm your fingerprints? We're not clear. So he has to do some homework and put it in writing and bring an amendment to the House, and let's debate it. But when I'm not clear from what you're saying, it sounds more like electronic type voting rather than biometrics being enhanced, because, but that is just because I'm not clear what the devil is talking about.
My final question, Mr. Shearer, in your estimation as a seasoned politician, what more do you think can be done to address concerns and to prevent instances of voter impersonation?
If wishes were horses, Mr. Cabral, if wishes were horses, the problem in 2020 wasn't voter impersonation. You were one of the people all over the place in the elections. The problem wasn't voter impersonation. The problem wasn't the count at the place of poll. The votes were counted at every polling station. The statements of poll were available at every polling station. The problem had nothing to do with voter impersonation. Nothing. There's no case of it. And if the PNC scrutiny, what do you call it, polling agents in the station saw it, why is it not recorded anywhere? I think you've been taken on a free ride. And I don't think the people of this country deserve that. We waited 5 months patiently, in a disciplined and loyal manner. Were it to have happened the other way round, you know what would have happened in this country? Civil war. It did not happen. We patiently, in a disciplined manner, waited for the recount. We went through the process of coming here every day to monitor the recount. The problem had nothing to do with voter impersonation. It had nothing to do with any fraudulence at the count at the place of poll. It had to do with GCOM officials, with members of the government of the APNU AFC conspiring, and it was stated in every election report of the observer missions. How dare they come now and talk about voter impersonation as if you're pulling a rabbit out of a hat? There was no record of voter impersonation. In 2015, there may have been, I remember one case, a guy voted in Kitty and then voted up Maika. He had 2 different passports. And he was caught, and he was taken care of. But he attempted to, but he didn't succeed. I remember that in 2015 election. But there is no case for 2020. So why manufacture new reasons? The most powerful tool in our electoral machinery, the most powerful mechanism is the counting of the votes at the place of poll. And the fact that every political party contesting the election can have an agent in the polling station. And they have a folio that shows them that if someone says Bishop Edghill goes and it doesn't look like the person who is Bishop Edghill, they cannot allow them to vote. In fact, under the new laws, these are criminal offenses if you try to do something. Mr. Norton has even read the draft bills, which have been posted up from November 2021 and the registration bill put up in September 2022. So I am not prepared to go on an excursion of academia. We're dealing with how do we prevent a situation like 2020 taking place. We dealt with the fraudulent elections of 1968, 73, 78 referendum, 1980 and 85 by a whole series of electoral reforms with the Carter Center and the eminent leaders. Number 1 was the counting at the place of poll. Number 2 was the composition of GCOM. Number 3 was the presence of the polling agents. And the statements of poll being public, etc. We then enhanced it in 94 with improved issues, that the statement of poll had to be put on the outside of every building, the counting would take place at the regional level, and so we didn't have to open every ballot box and do it back again unless there were questions. And so the issue of what happened in 73, where young people were killed because of trying to accompany the ballot box. When I was a commissioner of the Election Commission, held up at gunpoint in North Rhine-Veldt, although I had a letter signed by President Burnham that I was an Election Commission member. 3 of us were held at gunpoint. Those things are hard for people to imagine. But we have put safeguards in the laws, in the Constitution, to prevent those. So we're now doing the ones to do with what occurred in 2020. To talk about voter impersonation is to manufacture an issue that didn't exist. And the clean voters list he's talking about is not about going through the claims and objection and checking and verifying and stuff like that. It is about fundamentally removing migrants, people who don't live in Guyana, off the list. And that is because he has some notion in his head that all the Guyanese living overseas are going to come home and vote for the PPPC. That is how paranoid he is. The courts have ruled on this issue. There is no residency clause in our Constitution. As I said earlier, if Mr. Norton believes this is a fundamental issue for him and his party, then when the constitutional reform process begins, bring your constitutional amendment, let it be debated, let it go around the country, and it'll have to have 2/3 majority. It may even have to require a referendum, sir. So, Mr. Norton just talking in the air. He can't be that uninformed about what he's propagating and distracting people and misinforming people. So I do not buy the issue of voter impersonator, but the law, both as it is and the amendments, will have greater strengthening in terms of anybody permitting such things to happen or conniving to do such things or to try to collude to have such things done. But why isn't Mr. Norton talking about some other aspects to do with electoral reform, which is to do with the statements of poll? Where are the statements of polls of the PNC that they said they had and showed that they didn't match the PPP zone? Well, if that is so, why didn't they post those? Why haven't they made those available? Because if it is so, if I have an argument that the list is bloated and all these people voted who shouldn't have voted, then bring up your statements of poll. Why has he not done that? Because he can't. The statements of poll have signatures of every polling agent in the room, as well as the presiding officer, and some of those polling agents are polling agents for the APNU AFC coalition. That's why they can't bring it up. So they're just talking in the wind. Mr. Norton has to do his homework, and the more he talks, the worse it gets for himself and the members of his party. The more he talks, the worse it gets.
Mr. Shearer, is the PPP's position on residency in keeping with the High Court ruling, is that cast in stone?
Beg your pardon? Can you repeat? Yeah, you're sounding muffled. You know you don't have a big voice.
PPP's position as regards residency in line with the High Court ruling, cast in stone?
Are you telling me that I must tell the judiciary to change what they said? No. The separation of powers in Guyana, listen, don't ask me an hypothetical question, Chabrol. The issue is the Constitution talks about separation of powers. The executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. The judiciary interprets the Constitution. There was a case that went to the court to deal with the issue of residency, including dual citizenship, as well as the issue of residency. The courts have ruled on the matter. The court can only rule on the matter based on what the Constitution says. If the Constitution is amended, then the court will have to uphold what the Constitution amends. You know, there are other things in the Constitution that are linked to it. For example, in the same constitutional reform process, it allowed for people to be presidential candidates by birth or by blood, and recognized non-residency by saying that a candidate who wanted to be a president had to have 7 years living in Guyana. So this is not just one part of the Constitution you're dealing with. So I cannot comment on the judge's ruling. I uphold the judge's ruling.
What I was trying to get at from you, ma'am, is whether in the constitutional reform process, if the PP would support a change in the current provisions that speak.
We'll see when the consultation takes place. I'm not predicting that. This is a consultative process that's democratic. The PPP will have its opinion, the other parties will have their opinion, civil society will have their opinion, and the public. We will go to the public. Right now, Guyanese living overseas want to vote in Guyana. They want to actually be in Parliament. So we have to deal with this issue, but as long as the Constitution doesn't have a residency requirement, that is our Constitution, and we obey it. And so if Mr. Norton wants to make this a big issue, then let him do it, but do it properly and do it through the reform process. Bring his amendments, because there'll be several amendments to the Constitution that have to be made, not just one clause. And so if our Constitution says you could be president of Guyana by blood, only have to have 7 years residency in Guyana, so you are removing that part of the Constitution as well. This what you call flippant way of throwing out ideas by Mr. Norton without looking in any profound way is unfortunately a signal of his own limitations.
Last question,
and
Mr.
so I'm
Shearer.
not going to predict what my party is going to do. I'm saying that my party is going to go into the constitutional reform process, and we will go through it as we did the last time, clause by clause, looking at what is necessary to change now.
Last question, Mr. Shearer. Is the PEP fearful of losing the elections if the Constitution is amended to allow for all persons in Guyana to be registered?
No,
So why not?
we're not. But I will say this, again, you do recognize that Guyanese who are born overseas can get an overseas birth certificate, get a Guyana passport. So when you bring in all these residency things, all that will go. As I said, there are consequences. And when there's a lot of gaffe with no understanding of how entrenched these things are to do with residency and non-residency. Any Guyanese, born of a Guyanese, born in another country, why do you think the Venezuelan migrants, a lot of them are Guyanese, who were born in Venezuela, descendants of Guyanese, who have come back in. And I welcome, they're Guyanese, they're our citizens. It's our responsibility to take care of them. So are we saying that Guyanese who are living overseas, all these statutory provisions, including rights, will be removed? These are big issues. It's not just about a voter, a person not voting who's living overseas. This would be facile. It would be facile to examine that issue from that point of view. So this is something that has to be seriously discussed. Not a whims and fancy of Mr. Norton and his tribe, who think that they can mamagai the Guyanese people all the time, talking about voter impersonation, when the main thing was that they tried to steal the elections and the votes of the Guyanese people and keep themselves in power. So I'm not going to buy that. We'll see what happens. Let the people of Guyana speak. Are we afraid of them speaking? I'm not. I'm not. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for your patience again.